Garry Douglas with the North Country Chamber of Commerce joins us at the Roundtable this week. Welcome. Always good to have you.
Thank you. Always nice to be here.
The legislature is headed back to work now and is taking up a series of tax cuts being proposed by Governor Andrew Cuomo, several aimed at improving the business climate in upstate New York. The governor wants to eliminate the corporate tax for upstate manufacturers altogether. Get rid of surcharges on utilities, which on electricity, which has
been natural gas,
which has been a killer for a number of businesses, added cost, and also a rebate, tax credit for property taxes.
For property taxes for manufacturers.
So the combination, when you heard these proposals, what did you think?
It's an extremely powerful follow-up to a clear course that the governor has been on over the last 3 years. First, put the state's fiscal house in order so that we can get to the point where you can start to responsibly cut taxes, not through gimmicks and not through make-believe tax cuts that somehow you raise over here so you pretend you lowered it over there, but real tax reduction. And I know there's been some impatience in the business community. Oh, it's still a high tax state. It's still a high tax state. Well, you got to fix the boat first. Stop it from sinking. Now we can get to the port, and the port is lower taxes, and we're excited to see that coming this year. He promised it's happening, and it's coming in an exciting, targeted way. The theme of his State of the State and of the budget is, if we were to say what we wanted the two top themes to be, they would be tax relief and upstate economic development. Well, his themes are tax relief and upstate economic development, and they're meaningful. The reductions on upstate manufacturing, obviously, on the one hand, are targeting upstate, understanding that this part of the state is underperforming. Some areas are performing a little better than others. We happen to be one of those. Actually, it's been performing a little better than others, but we're underperforming overall. So we need more support. New York City is doing very fine, thank you. Long Island's doing very fine, thank you, except for having to recover from the storm, obviously. So that's good, but it is going to be, we believe, a powerful message in several ways. First of all, unlike some programs that are geared only to new companies or startups or growth, this says you've been around 40 years and you're not adding a lot of jobs, but you're staying in New York and you're struggling to stay competitive. We're going to help you out. So finally, we're paying attention to the still very large community of manufacturers we have in the North Country and across upstate who need help, who aren't just the newcomers who always get the help. At the same time, it's going to help us with the newcomers. In two ways. In a broad way, it's going to further send a message that this governor has already been sending through things like the Startup New York program across the country and across, in our case, Canada in particular, that take a fresh look at New York. You know, if you haven't looked at it in a while and you think, oh, it's just that awful, dysfunctional, high-cost state, zero. You know, zero is catchy. It isn't, 4.783, it's zero. Do they really mean zero? We want to find out more about that. And it's already happening, by the way, in the economic development community. Those questions are being asked. Prospects are already discussing and wanting to know more about this.
Has any other state done zero, or is that the best out there?
We don't know of anything that is zero as this governor is talking about, particularly, again, in combination with the Startup New York program, which for those new incoming or startup ventures that meet the qualifications that start in that program, it is truly zero. It's zero corporate tax, it's zero property tax, and something that is unique in the country, it's zero personal income tax on the employees for 10 years. And that also is going to help us draw in some very specific kinds of ventures that wouldn't come into New York yet. We have prospects now that we're talking with SUNY Plattsburgh and Clinton Community College about how we, when they're ready, how we can potentially make these work. But now what this does, for those who said, oh, there the state goes again, they're just taking care of some of the new guys and they're playing favorites. No, the governor is saying we're going to take care of everybody also. We're also going to zero out the corporate franchise tax for all manufacturers upstate. So that's a powerful 1-2 punch.
So between the startup, where they would come and locate on campuses, tax-free there, no income tax for the employees. That's one program. Now with this, how big of an incentive is that? How much is that going to help?
It's a huge
you?
incentive. Now, particularly for our area, most of our investment has been and will always be from Canada and particularly from Quebec as a function of our location and as a function of our strategies, which I think continue to be right. By the way, this is all very timely. If you put these same kind of actions out there two to 3 years ago, they wouldn't have had the same economic development impact because people weren't ready to pull triggers on investment in new things anyway, so it would have been much more theoretical. Well, if somebody did something new, it would benefit them. There are a lot of folks ready to do something new, a lot of companies ready and starting to think about expanding again. And in our area, Quebec is hot. They have lots of money, thank you very much. They didn't go through the recession we went through. Their banking system has remained stable. They're more ready to hop in right now and grow in the U.S. market than most U.S. business is. In fact, they see the opportunity to get ahead of the curve. The U.S. market is going to grow. They have the resources. Let's get back in there. We have a wave of interest in the economic development community in the North Country right now from very real prospects for investment in the North Country that is we haven't seen on this kind of scale and intensity since the mid-90s. So the timing is perfect because it introduces these tools just when we're entering a period when there's going to be a lot of conversations to use those tools. Now, Quebec has a corporate tax rate for most of its manufacturers approaching 12%. Vermont, which is one of our key competitors and being more aggressive, frankly, in the Quebec market in competition with us to try to get a share of that Quebec investment, well, they're at 8.5%. So let's sit down with a Quebec manufacturer and let's talk not only, you already know it's high cost back home, you're looking to grow in the U.S. market. If you ever been thinking about Vermont, what do you think is 0 versus 8.5%? You know, it's a staggering comparison. New Hampshire, 8.5%. Maine, 8.9%. So for us here in the North Country, it's particularly valuable given the specifics of what we're competing for.
I know the governor only announced this a few weeks ago. Are you already hearing interest from companies? You are?
Yes.
Transportation primarily, obviously this is a transportation sector here, or are you hearing from a broad range of companies?
It's a range of interests. Without naming names, just some of the prospects that we're talking with now, just in the last few weeks. One came from a very high former official in Quebec. It involves a U.S. sales operation, so we're talking white-collar jobs that's in direct competition with Vermont. A couple of others are transportation equipment companies, but not just suppliers to Bombardier and Novabus, new transportation equipment companies doing different things. In one case, actively looking at being out in the Midwest, now taking a much more serious look at being in New York. So out of this array of interest with a more powerful story to tell, you know, some of them we won't win, you'll never win all of them, but we're going to win more than we would have won a couple of years ago because we have these new tools.
We heard from a business owner here, George Bouillet, who owns Lakeside Container, after the governor announced his proposals. He's saying it's good for his company. Yep. He manufactures cardboard products for shipping and has a number of customers. He believes if their business is good or they expand, then he'll get more customers, he'll be able to hire more workers.
That's the function of manufacturing. Manufacturing, you know, one of the reasons that you want manufacturing ahead of most other kinds of private sector employment is, number one, it tends to pay the highest wages and benefits, so it has that value as opposed to retail or other kinds of sectors, but also has the greatest multiplier effect. Manufacturers are buying raw materials and supplies and services and using vendors and much more than most other kinds of business are, and doing more of that wherever they locate, because they need, particularly in today's modern world of just-in-time and efficient supply chains, they need to source goods and services from close by. So, if Schluter Systems, which happens to be a big customer, for example, of Lakeside Containers, if they're incentivized to do more here and therefore need more containers, they're going to buy more containers from Lakeside. So yeah, there is that ripple effect that is particularly important that isn't always seen in the first instance.
The governor's proposal, how's it playing with some of the major corporations, some of the major manufacturers here, Bombardier, Novabus, Schluter?
I would say they're all very pleased. Some are going to benefit more than others, depending on what their current tax status is and how they calculate their taxes. But again, if it benefits their suppliers or it benefits their customers, they're going to be impacted in various ways. In any case, I'll give you another example. Bombardier and Novabus have got a number of suppliers here, and by the way, we expect to see several new ones in the coming year. Many of those are 100% of what they're producing is going to either Bombardier or Novabus, or perhaps a combination of the two. Under New York's single sales factor for calculation corporate tax for calculating corporate taxes, 100% of their sales would be subject to state corporate taxation. Mm-hmm. Now, potentially, 100% would be subject to no corporate taxation. Now, what does that do? That makes them more competitive in their pricing to Bombardier and Nova, which in turn makes them, in a brutal world of competition for contracts, more competitive against companies, some of which they're competing against now that are producing their product in Kansas City and in Pennsylvania and other places. So it even drills down into the competitiveness of some of our companies here to get contracts and to outcompete competitors from other states. That little bit of help on taxes translated down into what they can offer on a bid can make a real difference.
All of this comes on top of what has been a great year for both Bombardier and Novabus. They have really landed major contracts.
They both went through a tough period. That tough period was mostly a function of a lack of contracts happening across the country, in part because we didn't have a multi-year federal transportation bill to give the confidence to the MTA and transit authorities to go out and make multi-year commitments for buses or trains. One of the things that Congress did a little over a year ago is they finally passed a multi-year transportation bill that really triggered a surge in contracts. And with a lot of help from our friends in Washington and Albany and at the MTA, things are humming again. They're employing again, the numbers are coming up, the plants are busy. And that, of course, also triggered the ability for Prevo to say, okay, we got that first contract from the MTA that we needed to jumpstart a new U.S. operation. We're coming to Plattsburgh. That addition over at Novabus is nearing completion as we speak. And by sometime, certainly before summer, we'll start to see them putting some new employees in there and start to see a whole new line of transportation equipment produced in Plattsburgh.
It hasn't created a lot of new jobs, but it has provided what appears to be steady employment for several years to come for both of those.
Yeah, and actually Bombardier was down at one point. I don't know if everybody realizes this, but they were down at one point to having not many more than 200 people working in that plant. In a plant that at one time at its height had several hundred, and they were struggling bringing small jobs in just to maintain that baseline, because if they went below that, you'd really start to lose even your core of your skills to rebuild from. They're back up to about 450 and growing, so actually it has had an impact. At Nova, they had to go down to part-time work with their employees during the low point. Now they're all full-time. So there really are direct benefits. And the other thing that we like about transportation equipment and why we have focused on it as a sector is that more than even most kinds of companies, if you produce widgets and some raw material comes in and you stamp it out and it goes out the other end, well, that's great, and there's jobs and there's activity. But what do bus and train makers do? They don't manufacture an awful lot in-house. They assemble components. And because of the way things work today, they require that most of those major component makers co-locate with them, because they can't have them hours away or on the other side of the border. They can't risk that when they need something or there's a problem, on top of meeting domestic content requirements too in the case of those suppliers being Canadian. So there's the rule of thumb is that for every job directly at a Bombardier or a Novabus or now with Prevo, there is at least one direct job in a vendor or supplier making components in your same community. And that's not counting the other jobs for other kinds of vendors and services that they purchase, but a very direct relationship with vendors and suppliers that automatically adds at least one for one.
So huge impact.
You go up to 450 from 200 at Bombardier, I guarantee the same thing has happened with the composite makers and the other component makers in town who are supplying them.
And it must always
And
be.
those aren't seen so much. People kind of maybe have a sense of how many people are at Bombardier, but the presence of some of those suppliers is less visible to people.
Yeah, how much of an impact they have on,
Yep.
on the region. It must be exciting for you whenever you hear one of your major manufacturers in town has picked up the option on the second part of a contract worth $1.5 billion.
Hell, billion with a B.
You mentioned the governor and the steps he's taken to try to help the economy.
Mm-hmm.
3 years ago, he took a page out of Bill Clinton's playbook and came up with this idea of having a competition for awarding the state grant money, economic development money.
We're starting to think that was probably a pretty good idea for the North Country. I don't
sure
know why.
Yeah, 3 wins in a row. Over the 3 years, about $300 million altogether.
I actually, counting some of the other awards, Connect New York for broadband, commitments made outside of the annual announcements like the Trudeau award, if you put it all together, all forms of funding for the priority projects in the plan, it's well over $350 million, which is extraordinary.
And in those 3 years, how much of a difference has that made in the North Country? Many of those projects are probably still getting underway.
Are still getting underway, but I mean the Bombardier expansion is essentially done. So that's making a difference. I think broadband is about to start making a big difference in the Adirondacks. Here's a very good example of how this process has helped us do things in a better, more responsive way here in the North Country. For years, before this governor came along, everybody moaned and groaned and talked about and how we need broadband. Broadband's the 21st century thing that we need, particularly in areas like the Adirondacks, so people can telecommute and you can do telemedicine and you can really kind of close that digital divide. It's more important there than anywhere. But you had areas like Hamilton County, one of the biggest pieces of geography in the state of New York, with 5,000 year-round residents. Huge distances between even houses. A straight private sector approach was never going to close the gap in areas like the Adirondacks. But everybody talked about it. Nobody actually did anything in terms of providing resources. This governor said, your region decides what economic development is. We're not going to tell you what economic development is like the old way. Well, it has to be biotech and it has to be this and it has to be 50 plus jobs. And we're not going to tell you any of that. You decide what's right for your region. You tell us what's important, and if it makes sense, we're going to back you. And we said broadband development in the Adirondacks in particular was of enormous transformational importance and had to finally be done. There have been more than a dozen projects funded over the last 2 years, and here's an astounding fact. By late this year, Hamilton County will have mainline broadband access throughout the county, north to south, east to west. In 2.5 years' time, we will have closed the most challenging gap in the entire state. And they just gave us $6 million to continue the job, and we're going to select some more projects soon to continue closing the gap around the North Country. That's going to have an impact. Investing in the future of Plattsburgh International Airport, making sure that Trudeau Institute stays in Saranac Lake, which was not a guarantee, and not only stays there, but now has the wherewithal and a partnership with Clarkson that is going to make it a real player and a real attraction for the still small but potentially large biotech cluster in the Adirondacks. So there are a number of things starting to have a real ripple effect, and over the next couple of years they will have more and more because they're the kind of foundational work we needed to do up here that nobody would give us money for before. We had to compete with the only notion that some people still have of economic development. Well, it's some big manufacturing company that has 100 or 600 or 1,000 jobs like Global Foundries, and you put some state money behind it and they build it and they employ people. Well, we got some things like that, and we hope to have some more of that, and we will. But economic development is also setting the stage so things can happen. Tourism is economic development, for example. That was discounted greatly under past strategies because it wasn't as sexy as manufacturing or high technology things.
And that was a big part of the award this year.
Yeah, but up here, it's what we have. And it is economic development to modernize tourism. And the thing we focused on up here is not marketing. We got funds for marketing, and even the governor is helping us do more with marketing. But we didn't need marketing so much. We needed development, modernization of our hotels, our attractions, things like the Whiteface Memorial Highway, so that continues to be a major attraction. New hotel development in Saranac Lake and Schroon Lake and over in the Thousand Islands to provide the kind of accommodations people want in destinations today as opposed to what too often they still find in the Adirondacks. Even broadband has an impact on tourism. The Wild Center, Adirondack Museum, Strand Theater in Plattsburgh. These are the kinds of things that create more attractions to develop more tourism, and we're being allowed to invest in those. 3 years ago, we were told that's not economic development. Well, it is. It just is. And those are the things that are going to benefit us for many years to come, and they're real and they're happening. And if some folks say, yeah, well, I'm not, all that money, and I'm not seeing much happening yet. Well, there is a lot happening, but also realize all that money and not seeing much happening yet. This whole process started just 2 years ago. So it is unfolding, and it will unfold over the next couple of years.
The airport got $4.5 million. Part of the big expansion, a $50 million expansion there. This money earmarked to help with establishing U.S. Customs there. And that's important because there are carriers that are waiting to come in there and offer international flights.
This now, and one of the most exciting, I think, medium-term developments for the region, will give Northern New York its first truly international airport. It's going to put the International in Plattsburgh International and be the only international airport across the entirety of Northern New York, to put that in some perspective. In the first instance, what will it allow? It'll allow actual international passenger service. And we know that will happen once we have it in place. The number one interest we've had from the very beginning have been carriers who want to do direct nonstop international service out of here to service the Montreal market without the high cost of going into Trudeau, frankly. Some of them are Canadian carriers, some of them are European, other international carriers. Some of them are our existing carriers like Spirit and Allegiant. I guarantee they'll both be the first to be doing, for example, Caribbean destinations, Mexico, out of here when we can do that. So that's part of it. There's more though. Once you have U.S. Customs presence at your airport, which we don't have now, and you got to have the right kind of facility and commitment to get to a point where you can also cover the cost of that, and we believe that'll happen within a few years of the startup. Here are other impacts it has. Right now, there's a lot of Canadian planes, corporate planes, private planes coming into the U.S. They have to stop at an airport close to the border and check in before they proceed to Florida or Washington or New York or wherever they're going. Where do they do that now? They do it in Burlington. We'd like them to do it here. They stop here. They're going to help support our customs operation. They're maybe going to buy some fuel here. They're going to discover the other services at this airport, maybe have maintenance work done. You start to pick that up. Some of them may even domicile planes here if they have U.S. Customs. You'll get to do other kinds of transient services internationally that can stop here for refueling or other activities if you have customs. If you're going to do international aircraft maintenance here, well, those pilots flying that plane, even if it's just a skeleton crew bringing an aircraft in from Europe, they got to check in with customs somewhere. Well, we're going to have customs presence here. If you're going to do cargo that comes in from Canada or Europe and comes in through here, it's got to be cleared by customs. They have to be here. If we know we've had queries from airlines currently servicing Trudeau who would like to use this as a backstop place to come when Trudeau is closed, when they can't land there. But if you've got a Canadian airline flying Canadians from, let's say, the Dominican Republic to Trudeau, and Trudeau is socked in with snow, but we know often that's not the case here in Plattsburgh when it is up there. We get kind of the same temperature, but not as much snow. We can be open here many times when they have difficulties. Plus they have late night curfews, which cause difficulties. But they could land at Plattsburgh. If we have customs to disembark those passengers, we can clear them. They can rent buses and take them the rest of the way to Trudeau, and that has been posed to us. So there's all these little additional operations that flow once you have customs on site.
And collectively, that could be a boon to the area.
It could be a boon, but it's not just about the passenger planes. It's about every aspect of airport development. We get asked all the time, do you have customs on site? And we have to say, well, no, we don't. We have customs nearby. They're up at the border. They're on call. They're very helpful when we ask them, and they are. but there's a very limited degree to which they can free up people to come down and occasionally clear something at the airport. Once that becomes a regular thing that you want to do constantly here, they won't be able to do it anymore unless we have them at the airport.
And you talked about some of the new projects, some of the new economic development. One of the more old-fashioned ones, if you will, is also a piece from last year, helping out International Paper and the mill down in Ticonderoga. That mill has been there a long time. That mill has high costs. They're looking to convert from oil to natural gas, hoping to bring it across Lake Champlain from Vermont.
Yep.
That project has won initial approval, but not for the phase to bring it to IP yet. But that, you talk about that often as an example of where you're going to help a long-time existing business try to keep hundreds of jobs in the region.
Yeah, and there's an example too. Economic development can't just be about the new company coming in. We got to pay attention to our key manufacturers who are here, who we know more than ever, and increasingly so as time goes on, are struggling with costs to be competitive, not just within the country, but more globally as the world comes together. International Paper is one of the most significant manufacturing employers in the North Country, by far the largest in Essex County. There's about 600 prime jobs there at the plant. There are also 600 direct jobs in the logging sector bringing materials, truckers and loggers who are totally dependent on that plant. That's 1,200 jobs dependent on that plant. And yet here you have that plant is we understand it, has the highest energy costs of any of IP's manufacturing facilities in the country. You know, well, okay, they're making that work right now, but you got to be concerned about that because we have seen, whether it's the old Imperial wallpaper mill or other factories, Alcoa, what's happening now in the North Country. You're not always just in competition with other companies, you're in competition within a company today. When you talk about big corporations with dozens of mill sites, they periodically take a look at the efficiency and the costs within the company, particularly when they're looking to shake out or consolidate capacity. And they're going to look at things like, let's weigh this. That energy cost at that plant is the highest in our whole system, and there's no reason to expect it's going to do anything but go up. That could become a factor at a time when it's then too late for you to try to address it, because it'll take several years to do that. So we're trying to be strategic in that sense. Look at situations like that where we can do the things that will maintain the efficiency and the competitiveness of that operation to at least help increase the future of that operation when inevitably those times come that you never know about until it's too late. Internally, the bean counters have said, we need to shake this place out or that place out. Well, we want it to be someplace other than the Adirondacks.
You mentioned Alcoa. Alcoa has announced it's going to close the remaining 2 pot lines at its Messina East plant. That's the plant that it has committed to put $600 million into a modernization, keep 900 employees there in exchange for the low-cost power it gets from the Power Authority. Some worries about that now, whether they're going to follow through with that after announcing that those 2 pot lines are closing down.
Our thanks to the governor. He's being very aggressive with them and should be. In terms of saying, whoa, wait a minute, you got some benefits here and you made some commitments. You can't just say now, well, things have changed, we've changed our mind, we know we took advantage of the low-cost power, but we're going to close now. No, you're going to have to meet those commitments, and I'm happy to see the governor do that. We'll see how that particular scenario works out, but I think it's also important that the message be going forward that, if you're going to make commitments in exchange for some assistance, stand by those commitments or expect that the state is going to hold you to them, unless there's some overriding reason, there's a deep recession or something, maybe numbers don't get hit. But simply say you're going to walk away on terms that are different than what you said several years ago, that's not acceptable, and they should be called on it.
For many years, people have said what would help potentially manufacturers, especially along the northern tier, is a rooftop highway. The governor, many people thought, touched on that in his State of the State. It seems more likely that he was talking about a specific bypass or truck route around Canton and Potsdam that the Economic Development Council had looked at.
Which we have put forward as a strategy, because it seemed that the conversation has been stuck in an all or nothing mode. Unless you come up with $4 or $5 or $6 billion in a federal transportation bill, which nobody thinks can happen in the near future, then nothing proceeds. that the way that this is most likely, particularly in today's environment of government spending going forward as opposed to the 1960s and 70s, would be piece by piece. Well, let's take a piece, and you get that piece done. Then you start looking at another piece, and over time you then start to get to a point where it starts to gel as a project that maybe gains enough attention and support to maybe get bigger pieces over time. And that's why the regional council took a lead in trying to say, well, let's talk about this in terms of a piece. Mm-hmm. Doesn't say we're abandoning the whole thing, but we're just being practical about this. However you do it, it's going to be a piece at a time anyway, so let's look at a piece. And the governor has embraced that, and it's a good step forward. They're going to take a solid look at it this year. Right now it's just a concept. You got to look at how it would be located, what the costs would be, what the impacts would be on the downtown, what the character of the properties are if there were a bypass. All of that will have to be dealt with. It always was going to have to be. But it's another example where the governor is paying attention to what the regional councils say.
And speaking of being practical, there are regions, there are states, there are economies that have desperately wanted an east-west highway for many years, from the Maritimes to Watertown. Is this region, where we are right here, clamoring for that? Is it important for manufacturing and businesses and for the economy here to have an east-west highway to get from 87 in Champlain to Watertown?
It's certainly crucial to have somehow some significantly enhanced east-west transportation capacity. Whether it's a segregated highway or whether some have proposed enhancements to the Route 11 corridor or some combination of the two or bypasses. I'm not qualified to determine that over the years. But the North Country Chamber has always said where things move is where prosperity occurs. And there certainly is a gap in there, particularly from St. Lawrence County over past the Malone-Chateauguay area, that kind of northern tier area in there that is just a little too distant from an interstate grade highway to really enjoy the level of interest in terms of manufacturing and other kinds of industrial investment that the Watertown area enjoys and the Plattsburgh area enjoys. And somehow figuring that out there's no doubt that's a crucial medium to long-term aim.
What would be the biggest deterrent? The cost? The estimate in 2008, $6 billion could be upwards of $10 billion now by some estimates.
And when you talk about it in those terms, you end up hitting the wall immediately, because the response becomes, well, there's no earmarking in transportation bills anymore. There's not enough money in federal transportation bills to fix what we have anymore, and there just isn't going to be that kind of authorization. And pragmatically, that's correct. That's why it's important to start to not immediately go to those numbers, but to say, yeah, but what about a piece? They've done this in some other places with an interstate system down in the southern tier. They started taking it on piece by piece through the years, and they've gotten there. And so the regional council's suggestion in partnership with John Putney and the St. Lawrence County board was that let's, if we get a piece done, that's momentum. That's more momentum than we've seen on this in 20 years. So let's do that, and the governor likes that approach.
Bill Owens announced a couple of weeks ago that he's not going to seek re-election. How disappointing is that? How much of a loss is that to the chamber, having for the first time in a long time, decades, if not longer, having a sitting congressman live in your community, having an advocate for border issues that Owens has been? How much of a loss is this going to be?
It's a challenge of transition, but we've been through it before. The most recent example in that same seat was when John McHugh left very unexpectedly. We had developed a great relationship and partnership with John McHugh in the redevelopment of the base and the startup of the airport. He had become a great friend and champion. He really got us. We really had that kind of working relationship. He had also become probably the most respected figure in the U.S. House on U.S.-Canadian border issues. We needed the next congressman to be that. He became that. In Bill's case, particularly on the border issues, we had a head start because he had been working on those things and working with Canadian companies for more than 20 years. So he didn't come in with training wheels on that subject and have to learn. But we are already in contact with, and actually have been for the last couple of months, the potential candidates for the seat. We know there'll now be some other faces coming out. They're starting to and doing soundings, and the chamber certainly has heard from a few of them in both parties. We will sit down and brief them. We will lay the groundwork. We will tell them the things they need to understand. We'll show them that we're the ones that can help them understand and work on those things. And so I feel good about the future. There'll be a learning curve. There'll be changes in a transition. For the Plattsburgh area, is there something lost in not kind of having the hometown boy there? Absolutely. Because you start with a well of direct friendship that you have to kind of develop with somebody new and a line of direct knowledge. I've sometimes have said, I enjoyed a great relationship with John McHugh. We became very good friends. We communicated constantly between his office and the chamber, but not almost every day. I find myself communicating with Bill Owens almost every day by phone or by email. So there'll be change, but we'll deal with it. We've dealt with transitions before. We'll deal with this one. We have a compelling story. We know how to do this. North Country will do fine.
If someone asks how much difference can one congressman make, you could point to Bill has made a difference when it came to a couple of big issues, the moving of resources from the border to the south and talk of a border fee. Yeah,
there are two examples this week. The omnibus appropriations bill that was just finalized by Congress, which some people think couldn't be done. Just last fall when our chamber did its annual strategic planning retreat and we outlined our key concerns for this year, top of that list was the federal budget situation, in particular in its connection with U.S. border operations. That we know, in the case of the wackadoodle proposal for a border crossing fee, which seems to come up every several years, is a good example of this. Most Congress and most senators aren't from the border areas. They don't get it. They don't understand it's the single biggest economic asset that the country has, and that you don't want to mess with it. You want it to be efficient and fluid. They don't get that because they're not near it. They don't live with it. And so we had reasons to believe that in addressing the federal budget deficit, which needs to be addressed over time, that one of the things that could very well take a hit are border operations, particularly the northern border operation, that we would start to see less resources and less personnel and be challenged to maintain the degree of fluidity and optimum efficiency that we've achieved at Champlain, for example. Very concerned about that. Well, lo and behold, thanks to the leadership of, frankly, of Bill Owens as a key leader, and also both of our senators and some others from border states, we not only haven't seen a cut, we've seen increased funding for U.S. border operations, understanding that it is important to the economy and federal tax revenues and other revenues that come from that relationship with Canada. And of course, we have the language in there that will now basically prohibit even the expenditure of money to study the ridiculous notion of a border crossing fee in the future, which will just make it harder the next time that congressman from Iowa or Nebraska or somewhere comes up with that idea to say, well, first of all, we got to change a federal law to even consider that. So it puts an impediment into place. He did those things.
And finally, we talk about the border. Champlain Port of Excellence is moving along. The new bus and truck inspection areas are in. Now Canada is saying it is going to invest millions of dollars on its side at La Colle. How critical is that to have Canada upgrading its crossing?
It's a final piece of the vision. The vision of a port of excellence was efficiency and flow in both directions. A border crossing only works as efficiently as it works in both directions. If you have a great experience in one direction but an awful experience in the other, your sense is, I had an awful experience. That's what you're going to remember. We got things working well on the U.S. side. We have been saying and actively lobbying in Ottawa for several years with our partners at the Federation of Quebec Chambers, the Montreal Board of Trade, the Quebec government, and others, saying to the Canadian government, frankly, well, the U.S. government said this border crossing is a priority. They spent $107 million. Want to explain to us again what it is Canada's doing? Why isn't this a priority? And frankly, why isn't Quebec's main border crossing not a priority? Why are the Ontario crossings only the only seeming priorities, and finally this current Canadian government gets that, the Harper administration. They provided the $49 million. The planning process will go forward this year. We're in touch with Canadian Border Services. They have promised that we and other stakeholders on both sides of the border will be allowed to be part of the design process, as we brought everybody to the table during the design of the U.S. facility. So it's a major step. The one remaining thing that we need to fix, and we're also working on, and think this year we may finally get to an answer, is the pre-clearance of Amtrak trains. So that we get around that 1 to 2 hour stoppage at Rouse's Point that takes as long as the most challenging person who happens to be on the train that day is before they can let the train proceed. There's a pre-clearance treaty under final negotiation between the U.S. and Canada, which will allow several things. It will allow U.S. Customs to pre-clear Amtrak trains north of the border so that we don't have to have those stoppages. It also will fix the situation at Messina, Cornwall. It will allow the Canadian border crossing operation that's now, because it got kicked off the island, is now in this little dysfunctional situation as you get to the other side of the bridge at Cornwall, allow it to be over on the U.S. side of the border next to the U.S. facilities. It'll allow Canadian agents to operate and do things more efficiently there. So there's two North Country impacts of that treaty, and we hope that'll go forward this year.
And that's been talked about at a number of locations, consolidating, having the U.S. and Canadian customs in one location.
It's the answer for those little border crossings like Churubusco, where that unfortunate unilateral decision was made to close one side while the U.S. was improving the other side. Well, the answer to keeping those little crossings open, particularly between two friendly countries like the U.S. and Canada, if we can't do it together, nobody can. To agree to cooperate those small border crossings, therefore keeping them open. You got two agents there, one Canadian, one American in the same building.
And both governments seem to be getting on board?
That's part of the Beyond the Border agreement that's where they're working out these arrangements now. And that's significant to guaranteeing the future of several of our small border crossings across northern New York, so that we don't find a few years from now one of them's under threat from one government or the other to try to save money.
Garry Douglas, thanks a lot for taking the time to come in and talk with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.